Welcome to the Depth Dive. Today, we're tackling a really significant historical event, the 1999 NATO bombing of Yugoslavia.
Indeed, a complex topic.
Absolutely. And we've pulled together quite a range of sources for this, contemporary news reports, government inquiry bits, legal analyses, human rights
A
investigations.
real mix, yeah.
Our goal here really is to get past the headlines, the initial justifications, and really unpack the key claims, the consequences, sort of understand the deeper insights these sources offer.
And what jumps out almost immediately, I think, is the difference in the stated reasons for the bombing.
Right. Let's get into that. You have figures like Gerhard Schröder, the German Chancellor, then saying very clearly it was needed to stop a humanitarian catastrophe. He pointed to what he called Milosevic's merciless war in Kosovo.
But then, almost straight away, our sources show this counter-narrative emerging.
Okay.
There's the report, "Es begann mit einer Lüge." It began with a lie, based on that ARD documentary.
Ah, yes, anger and worth.
Exactly. And their core argument is that the German government, and really NATO by extension, well, they relied on facts that were either, let's say, fabricated or seriously twisted to get public support for the war.
Which right away makes you question the info people were getting.
Definitely.
And it wasn't just some fringe voice saying this. Rudolf Scharping, the German defense minister at the time, he was out there very publicly painting this picture of a massive disaster.
A really dire picture.
Hundreds of thousands of refugees inside Kosovo, huge numbers overall, an unquantifiable number of deaths, and this was before NATO even started bombing.
That's a very strong claim. But it clashes pretty dramatically with what the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, was finding. They had people right there.
On the ground, yeah.
And their assessment for March 1999, the month the bombing began,
Right.
was, well, they'd recorded only 39 deaths in all of Kosovo before the air campaign started.
39 versus unquantifiable numbers. That's a massive gap.
It really is. It makes you pause.
It does.
And this wasn't just some buried statistic. You had Heinz Lokwai, a former OSCE general, and Norma Brown, a U.S. diplomat who was in Kosovo,
Okay.
both saying quite clearly, based on what they saw, there wasn't a humanitarian catastrophe justifying war before the bombing. Brown even mentioned that within NATO and the OSCE, the feeling was more that a crisis was likely if NATO did start bombing.
Wow. So if it wasn't this pre-existing catastrophe that was being talked about, how did the OSCE describe what was actually happening?
They basically saw it as a civil war,
Yeah.
Between the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army, the UCK, and Yugoslav security forces.
Okay.
Observers saw villagers fleeing, fighting, yes, but, and this is important, they often came back home after the clashes died down.
So displacement linked to active fighting, not necessarily a systematic campaign before the intervention.
That seems to be the picture they painted. It
Yeah.
wasn't suggesting some kind of pre-planned expulsion at that point.
Which lines up more with some of those critical reports questioning the official story.
It does. And we even have a quote here from secret German Defense Ministry reports from that time. It says, in the past few days, there have been no major armed clashes. Serbian security forces are recently limiting their actions to routine operations, like checks, patrols, looking for weapons.
Routine security operations, not a massive offensive driving a catastrophe.
Exactly. A very different internal assessment compared to the public statements about imminent disaster.
Okay, so just to recap this first bit,
Yeah.
a huge difference between the public reason given stopping this massive humanitarian crisis and what observers on the ground and even internal intelligence were actually reporting.
Yeah, a really significant divergence right from the start.
What does that tell us then?
Well, it sets the scene, doesn't it? This initial contradiction really leads us into looking at some of the specific propaganda claims used later to, build and keep that public support going.
Right. Let's dig into those. One that really jumps out is Scharping's claim, echoed by Joschka Fischer's Never Again Auschwitz line,
A very powerful comparison.
about an alleged concentration camp in the Pristina football stadium for Kosovo Albanians. That image, it's clearly meant to evoke the Holocaust.
Extremely potent imagery.
Yeah.
But what's striking is the direct eyewitness account we have. Shaban Kelmendi, a Kosovar politician. His house was literally right next to the stadium. He stayed in Pristina through the whole war.
And he said,
He stated very clearly on camera, there were never any prisoners in the stadium. Its only use, a helicopter landing pad. That just completely pulls the rug out from under that specific, very emotional claim.
wow, A local resident just flatly contradicting it. Okay, then there was the Rugovo incident. Scharping claimed a massacre there, right?
Yeah.
Serbian special police killing innocent civilians.
Yes, he held a big press conference, showed photos.
I remember the headlines.
Therefore, we wage war. It was very direct, linking this alleged atrocity to the need for the bombing.
Yeah.
But the Secret Defense Ministry report tells a different story. It says January 29th, 1999, Rugovo, 24 Kosovo Albanians and 1 Serbian policeman killed in a battle.
A battle, not a massacre of civilians. Again, a huge difference in narrative.
A fundamental difference.
And wasn't there more from the OSCE observers on this one too?
There was. Henning Hinch. He was the first OSCE observer on the scene there.
Okay.
And he explicitly told Scharping it was a battle, not a civilian massacre. He also said the bodies in those press conference photos, they'd been collected by Serbian authorities and by Hinch himself and his Russian OSCE colleagues.
Collected.
Yeah, from different spots around the area, and then laid out after the fighting stopped.
So the visual proof shown to the public was staged, essentially, or at least misrepresented.
Well, it certainly wasn't bodies found as they fell into massacre. They were gathered and arranged in a way that heavily implied systematic killing. It was clearly a constructed narrative designed to influence public opinion.
Okay, moving on. Operation Horseshoe. This needs discussing. Presented as this big, pre-planned Serbian operation to ethnically cleanse Kosovo.
That's right. Scharping announced it in April '99, used that horseshoe encirclement image.
Very memorable.
And it became, really, a key justification for the ongoing bombing. The German Defense Ministry even put out a brochure with supposed evidence.
Including a photo.
Yes, a photo supposedly showing a village attacked by Serbs before NATO got involved to prove this was a preemptive Serbian plan.
But it began with a lie. Report casts doubt on this.
Big time. When you look closely at the photo itself, the date is clearly visible. April 1999.
After the NATO bombing had already started.
Precisely. Which completely undermines the claim it showed something happening before NATO intervened as part of this grand Serbian plan.
And do we have accounts from the actual village in the photo around Dubrava?
We do. An eyewitness, Shepard Kepi. He said the villagers left on March 25th, after NATO strikes began, following an evacuation order from the UCK. And he specifically identified himself and others there as UCK soldiers defending the village.
So not defenseless civilians being driven out by Serbs before NATO stepped in, actually UCK soldiers evacuating after bombing started.
Completely flips the official narrative presented with that photo.
The report also mentions atrocities in a place first called Senovici, later Peter Štetica, used as more proof for Horseshoe. And this really weird claim about Serbs using candles in attics to light gas leaks in cellars.
It's bizarre and technically very dubious, but yeah, that was part of the narrative.
And what did residents say?
Fatmir Zamiri from Peter Štetica testified the destruction shown happened in June 1998, months before Operation Horseshoe supposedly started.
June 98.
Yeah, and it was caused by shelling, he said, not this strange candle gas method.
There's that documented exchange, too, where a journalist questions Scharping on the physics of it.
Oh, that's quite something. The journalist points out, gas is heavier than air. It sinks. How does a candle in the attic light it in the cellar?
And Scharping's response?
He gets flustered, basically suggests trying it with a bottle. It really shows how flimsy the claim was.
And wasn't the text and date later removed from that photo in the ministry's brochure?
It was. Quietly taken out in later editions. No explanation. Which kind of suggests they realized the evidence was problematic, to say the least.
Right.
Plus, Heinz Lokwe, the OSCE general, confirmed that Defense Ministry experts themselves had said back in November '98 there was no evidence of this Operation Horseshoe plan. What they saw aligned with OSCE reports, basically. The ongoing civil conflict situation.
So, looking across these examples, the stadium, Rugovo, Horseshoe, there's this pattern. Government claims contradicted by eyewitnesses, by international observers, even by their own internal reports.
A very consistent and, frankly, troubling pattern. It really makes you question the basis on which this major military action was justified to the public and decision-makers.
Which brings us neatly to the next critical point, the legality of the whole thing under international law.
Absolutely central.
Because the bombing happened without a specific UN Security Council mandate. The body meant to authorize force.
And that's the core legal issue. The UN Charter, Article 2.4, basically forbids using force against another state unless it's self-defense or the Security Council explicitly says, okay.
Neither applied here.
Correct. So NATO acted without that clear UN backing. This sparked huge debate. Was it legal? Did it undermine the UN system? Scholars, states, Still debated today.
NATO framed it as humanitarian intervention, right, to stop atrocities in Kosovo. How does that idea fit legally?
Well, humanitarian intervention, the idea that you can use force in another country to stop mass human rights abuses, is very controversial in international law.
Still is.
Still is. There's been movement towards the responsibility to protect principle, R2P.
Right.
But back in '99, there wasn't a clear, accepted legal green light for unilateral military action like NATO's without the Security Council. It created this massive tension between state sovereignty, a bedrock principle, and the urge to protect human rights.
And countries like Russia and China were strongly against it.
Very strongly. They saw it as violating Yugoslavia's sovereignty and setting a dangerous precedent.
Yeah. The "it began with a lie" report mentions this U.S. policy phrase, with the UN if possible, without it if necessary.
Yeah, that phrase and comments from people like Wayne Merry, a U.S. advisor, talking about NATO moving beyond just defense, it points to the wider geopolitical currents.
What were the implications there?
Huge geopolitical fallout, especially for NATO-Russia relations. Things got very tense. And it fueled worries about powerful states maybe bypassing international rules when they felt like it, a sort of might makes right concern.
Let's shift focus slightly to the media's role. It seems there's been some soul-searching in journalism about the coverage.
There has, yes. Andreas Polonchek from ARD Actuel gave a pretty critical assessment. He said the media was abused, basically.
How so?
The intense pressure for dramatic pictures meant often the truth or accuracy wasn't properly checked, and not enough deep, critical analysis in the mainstream coverage, he felt.
Eric Folleth from Spiegel, the magazine, also admitted mistakes.
He did. Acknowledged they didn't give enough space to voices critical of the war, the official line. Though he did note, Spiegel did report early on about Operation Horseshoe, even though its truthfulness later came under serious fire.
But some critics were harsher.
Oh, yes. Dieter Lutz from a Peace Research Institute basically accused the media of just following Bond's reason of state, uncritically repeating the government's justifications.
And Herman Gremliza,
editor of Concrete, he claimed he knew Horseshoe was false at the time, but couldn't get traction, was ignored. It paints a picture of, well, a complex and sometimes problematic relationship between government narratives, media coverage, and public opinion in wartime.
Another really serious issue the sources raise is the use of depleted uranium, DU.
Yes, the use of DU, mainly in Kosovo, but elsewhere in Yugoslavia too, has caused a lot of worry. Long-term health, environmental effects. It's a major concern.
What exactly is DU and why was it used?
It's a very dense metal, byproduct of uranium enrichment, mildly radioactive. Its density makes it great for armor-piercing shells. NATO forces are estimated to have used something like 9 to 11 tons of it. Kosovo, Serbia, Montenegro were the main areas hit.
And the health risks, what are they?
Two main types. First, chemical toxicity. It's a heavy metal, like lead. If you inhale or ingest the dust particles, it can potentially harm kidneys, liver, maybe cause neurological issues, suppress the immune system.
Okay, and a second.
Radiological risk, it gives off alpha radiation. Not dangerous outside the body, can't penetrate skin. But if those tiny particles get inside, inhaled into lungs, ingested, they can sit there radiating internal tissues for a long time. That could potentially increase risks for things like lung cancer, leukemia, possibly birth defects, though the direct proof in humans is still debated scientifically.
Are there observed effects mentioned in the sources from the Balkans?
Yeah, there were reports, a lot of anecdotal evidence, suggesting possible rises in cancer rates in heavily affected areas. Also anecdotal reports about birth defects, and definitely soil and water contamination in some places.
So potential long-term exposure through the environment.
Exactly. The scientific consensus on the exact impact, the direct cause and effect, is still, let's say, mixed or evolving. But organizations like the UN Environment Program, UNEP, have consistently called for ongoing monitoring, risk assessment, and cleanup where needed.
Finally, we absolutely have to talk about civilian casualties, a tragic, critical aspect. Human Rights Watch did a major investigation, right?
They did, a very thorough one. They documented 90 separate incidents over the 78-day campaign that resulted in civilian deaths. About 500 Yugoslav civilians killed in total. 500.
And did they look at the intended targets in those incidents?
Yes. Mostly military installations, but importantly, they also identified at least 9 incidents where the targets seemed non-military, or at least HRW felt their military value was questionable under international humanitarian law.
Can you give examples of those?
Sure. The Serb radio and television building in Belgrade. The new Belgrade heating plant. Several bridges that didn't seem to have a clear military purpose at the time.
And many of these happened in cities. despite precision weapons.
That's a key finding. At least 33 of these fatal incidents were in populated urban areas, 6 in Belgrade alone. And yes, despite the use of precision-guided munitions, the use of cluster bombs near Nice was particularly bad. Lots of civilian deaths there in several incidents. It's, yeah, sobering to think about the human cost.
Cluster bombs weren't just used near Nice, though.
No, HRW confirmed U.S. and U.K. use in at least 7 incidents, maybe more. The estimated cluster bombs caused somewhere between 90 and 150 of those 500 civilian deaths.
Was there any change in policy on them?
Yes, the U.S. stopped using them mid-campaign, around mid-May '99. This was after reports of civilian casualties and international pressure. The U.K., however, continued to use them.
What about civilian deaths inside Kosovo itself?
HRW documented 32 incidents there. Many involved attacks on mobile targets. And the report does raise the question, did NATO pilots flying at high altitudes contribute to misidentifying targets sometimes, leading to civilians being hit?
A difficult question.
Very. And then there's the incident at Karisa. Deeply troubling. There's evidence suggesting Yugoslav forces might have deliberately used displaced Kosovar civilians as human shields, which would mean they share responsibility for the 87 civilians killed in that NATO bombing.
Despite all this, the 500 deaths, the questionable targets HRW concluded no war crimes by NATO. But they did find violations of international humanitarian law.
That's the crucial distinction they made, yes. No war crimes found, but they did find NATO violated international humanitarian law, IHL, in several ways.
Such as?
Using cluster bombs near populated areas. Attacking those questionable targets we mentioned, not giving adequate warnings to civilians, not taking enough precautions when hitting mobile targets where civilians might be present, and generally not doing enough to verify civilians weren't near intended military targets.
That number, 500 civilian deaths documented by HRW, it's quite different from some official figures at the time, isn't it?
It is. U.S. officials were talking maybe 20, 30 incidents of collateral damage. The Yugoslav government claimed thousands dead. HRW's verified 500 sits in the middle.
Important context.
And also important is the Dubrava prison case. Some prisoners died from NATO bombs, tragically, but many more were actually executed by Yugoslav prison guards after the bombing. Shows how complex attributing deaths can be and why verified investigations like HRW's are vital.
So what was HRW's main goal, their overall takeaway on the civilian deaths?
Their main focus was documenting the deaths as a step towards assessing NATO's compliance with IHL, the laws of war. Their conclusion: civilian deaths happened in many different situations, not necessarily tied just to how intense the fighting was.
Meaning
Different choices about targets, about weapons, could likely have reduced civilian harm. They pointed to NATO changing its rules for attacking convoys and bridges after civilians were killed, as proof adjustments were possible.
they highlighted specific concerns, too.
Yes, the bombing of Serb radio and TV, very controversial. The use of cluster bombs. And they noted a lack of public accountability from NATO countries about specific missions that caused civilian deaths.
Which brings us back to that term collateral damage, used so often then. Based on HRW finding IHL violations, can we just call these 500 deaths unavoidable collateral damage?
Well, legally, under IHL, collateral damage means accidental harm to civilians during a lawful attack on a military target. But, and this is key, attacks causing excessive civilian harm compared to the expected military gain are indiscriminate.
So HRW's concerns.
Their concerns about proportionality, the targets chosen, the precautions taken. They strongly suggest at least some of those deaths probably went beyond the legal definition of acceptable collateral damage. They likely constituted violations of international humanitarian law.
This has been, well, a really deep and complex look at a very controversial moment, just to try and summarize the key takeaways from all these sources we've looked at.
There's a lot to synthesize.
It is. We've seen the contested reasons for starting the bombing. Strong evidence of propaganda, maybe misinformation, used to build support, the whole legal complexity around acting without a UN mandate, serious ethical questions about civilian deaths, the use of DU, and even the media looking back critically at its own role.
And I think if there's one overarching thought from all this, it's just how incredibly complex military interventions are. The consequences last for years, decades even.
Absolutely.
It really hammers home how vital it is to question official stories, especially in wartime, to seek out different perspectives, and the absolute need for accountability and sticking to international law, even when things are chaotic and morally gray.
We really hope that you, listening, will maybe dig deeper into these issues yourself. Explore the sources, think about the different angles we've discussed, understanding the nuances, the complexities beyond the simple sound bites. It's just so important for learning from the past and maybe navigating the challenges we face now.